Welcome back, everyone. Before we dive in, make sure you drop your thoughts and the lessons you took from this story in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Let's get into it. My name is Corey Bennett. I am 38 years old. The words hit me like a freight train on what should have been an ordinary Wednesday evening. My wife sat across from me at our kitchen table, fidgeting with her wedding ring as she delivered the sentence that would change everything. She said, "I want a divorce." There was no build-up, no explanation, just 4 words that shattered 12 years of marriage while I was finishing a slice of leftover pizza from dinner. I set down my slice and looked at her, waiting for some kind of elaboration. She stared at the table as if she were reading invisible instructions. I said, "Okay, can I ask why?" She launched into a careful speech about growing apart, wanting different things, and feeling unfulfilled. Then she added, "But here's the thing. I do not want us to become strangers. I think we can still be close friends after this. Really close friends. We have been together so long. It would be strange to just cut each other off completely, right?" I nodded slowly, trying to understand what she was really asking for. She wanted the freedom to pursue whatever new life she had planned, and she wanted to keep me around as her emotional support, her handyman, her emergency contact, and possibly her financial safety net. I repeated, "Close friends. What exactly does that look like to you?" Her face brightened. She said, "Well, we would still be there for each other when we need support. We would still help each other with problems. We would still call each other when something important happens, just without the marriage part. It would be healthy." I almost laughed because it sounded like she wanted all the benefits of having a husband without actually being married. Instead of saying that, I decided to play along. I said, "That sounds reasonable. Friends help friends, right?" She let out a breath she had been holding. She said, "Exactly. I'm so glad you understand. I worried you would be angry or would try to fight this." I said, "Why would I fight it? If you want a divorce, then that is what we will do. And if you want to be close friends afterward, I am open to that too." Jasmine squeezed my hand across the table and said, "Thank you for being so mature about this. I knew you would get it." What she did not know was that I was already sketching the outline of what friendship would actually look like. Real friends have boundaries. Real friends do not drop their problems onto each other every time life becomes complicated. Real friends absolutely do not expect one another to solve financial emergencies or provide unlimited emotional labor. I decided that I would take her at her word and be the kind of friend who treated her like a capable adult, not a dependent. Over the next few weeks, as we filed paperwork and divided what could be divided, she returned to the friendship idea. She said, "It will be so nice to still have someone to call when my car makes that weird noise, and it is comforting to know that when I am feeling overwhelmed, I could still reach out, and it would be great to maintain the connection we built." I agreed, because technically she was right. Friends help. They just help differently than spouses do. The legal part moved quickly. We did not have children. We had separated our finances after some early arguments about money. She kept the house because she wanted it and said she could afford the mortgage with her job at the marketing firm. I packed my belongings, moving out over a couple of weekends, staying with my brother in Cleveland while I figured out my next step. On the day I loaded the last box into my truck, Jasmine hugged me briefly and said, "This is just a transition, not an ending. Our friendship will be better than our marriage because there will not be any pressure or expectations. We will both be happier this way. You will see." I nodded and said, "I am sure it will work out." I mean, in a way. I had a feeling she was about to receive exactly what she had asked for. 3 days after I officially moved out, my phone rang at 9 o'clock in the evening. Jasmine's name filled the screen. I let it ring twice before answering. I said, "Hey, what is up?" She said, breathless, "Oh my goodness, I am glad you picked up. The garbage disposal is making a horrible grinding noise. I think it is broken." She paused and added, "I tried looking online, but all the instructions are confusing. Can you come take a look at it?" I let the request sit for a moment. I said, "Tonight?" She said, "Well, yes. I cannot use the kitchen sink until it is fixed, and I have a big presentation tomorrow. I really need to get this sorted out tonight." I said, thoughtfully, "That does sound frustrating. Have you tried calling a plumber?" There was a pause. She said, "A plumber for something this simple? That would cost about $200. I said, "Probably. That is what people usually do when their garbage disposal breaks." She said, "But you know how to fix it. You have fixed it before. I said, I have, when I was your husband. Now we are friends, remember? I could hear her processing that. She said, friends help each other with things like this. I said, yes. And as your friend, my advice is to call a professional or maybe ask one of your other friends if they know about disposals. Someone in your circle has handled this before. There was a longer stretch of silence. She said, so, you are not coming over? I said, not tonight. I have plans. My plans were a beer and a new show, but they were still plans. She said, okay, I guess I'll figure something out. I said, I'm sure you will. Good luck with your presentation. After I hung up, I smiled. The friendship era had officially begun. The garbage disposal was only the beginning. A few days later, the smoke detector chirped at 3 o'clock in the morning, and she called me, whispering urgently, I cannot sleep with this thing going off every 30 seconds. Can you come over? I sat up in bed, rubbing my eyes. I said, here's an idea. Take the battery out and deal with it tomorrow. She said, I do not know how to take it out without breaking it. I said, online video tutorials exist, where you could ask a neighbor. Did you not say Mrs. Johnson is often up late watching television? She said, I cannot bother Mrs. Johnson at this hour. I asked, but you can bother me. She seemed surprised by the question. I said, friends respect each other's sleep schedules. I will send you a link. I texted her a tutorial. 20 minutes later, the chirping stopped, so apparently she handled it. Then came the car situation. During her lunch break, the check engine light came on. She called and said, what if it is serious? What if the engine explodes? I said, try not to laugh. Engines do not typically explode because of that warning. When was your last oil change? She said, I am not sure. A while ago. I asked how long is a while. She said, maybe 6 months. I whistled softly and said, you probably need an oil change and a basic tune-up. I know a good shop. She said, can you take it for me? Mechanics always upsell women. I said, I am at work. She said, after work then? I said, I have plans, but I can recommend a shop that is honest and fair. She said, frustrated, you are really not going to help me with this? I said, I am helping by giving you the name of a trustworthy mechanic. Friends share information. They do not always run the errand. The pattern continued. She needed furniture, move on a weekend. I was busy. She asked me to review her resume because she was complaining about her boss and considering a job change. I suggested she use a professional service or have a colleague she trusted offer feedback. She mentioned a clogged drain and assumed I would show up with a plumber's snake. Each time, I declined politely and offered alternatives. Each time, she sounded shocked that I was not dropping everything to solve her problems. The breaking point came on a Friday evening. I was at a sports bar in Cleveland with my brother, Aaron, when my phone vibrated several times. I let it go to voicemail, then it rang again immediately, and again. Aaron glanced at the screen and said, you should probably answer that. I checked and saw 7 missed calls from Jasmine. I called back, thinking there might be an actual emergency. She said, nearly shouting, I have been trying to reach you for an hour. Where were you? I said, having dinner. What is wrong? She said, I locked myself out of the house and I do not know what to do. I waited for more. That was the entire crisis. I said, okay, did you call a locksmith? She said, do you know how much those cost? I said, probably less than you think. There are 24-hour services. Jasmine said, you have a spare key. It was true. I had forgotten to return it when I moved out. She said, so, can you come let me in? I asked, where are you? She said, sitting on the porch. It is cold and I need to get inside. I looked at Aaron. He tried to pretend he was not listening, but he clearly was. I said, what did the locksmith say? She said, they said $200 and about an hour. I said, so you will be inside in an hour for $200. She said, that is ridiculous. You could be here in 20 minutes for free. I said, I could. I'm not going to. The silence was sharp and loud. She said, excuse me. I said, you wanted to be friends. Friends do not expect each other to drop everything to drive across town to solve problems that have standard solutions. Friends do not expect personal emergency services on demand. She said, this is different. This is an actual emergency. I said, being locked out is inconvenient, not an emergency. You are not in danger. You're not hurt. You have to decide whether $200 is worth waiting on the porch for an hour. I could hear her breathing quicken. She said, I cannot believe you are doing this. I said, I am not doing anything to you. I am being your friend. As your friend, I am treating you like a capable adult who can solve her own problem. She said, this is not what friendship looks like. I said, this is exactly what it looks like. Boundaries, reasonable help, and respect for time. She hung up. Aaron raised an eyebrow. He said, that sounded intense. I said, she is learning that divorce has consequences. He said, do you think she will figure it out? I picked up my burger and said, smiling, eventually, or she will run out of emergencies. An hour later, I received a text message that said, the locksmith came. $180. Thanks for nothing. I replied, glad you were inside safely. See, you handled it. She did not respond. In the quiet afterward, I felt a complicated mixture of relief and hope. Maybe this was the beginning of something healthier for both of us. 6 weeks after the divorce was finalized, my phone buzzed on a Saturday morning. The text read, emergency. Need to talk as soon as possible. Can you come over? Against my better judgment, I decided it might actually be serious. When I arrived at what used to be our house, she was at the kitchen table, surrounded by paperwork. She looked like she had not slept. She said, thank God you are here. She stepped forward as if to hug me. I did not reciprocate. She said, I am in serious trouble. I sat across from her and glanced at the envelopes. I saw past due notices mixed with bank letters. I said, what kind of trouble? She said, the mortgage payment is due Monday, and I am short. I said, how short? She said, $800. I leaned back. $800 was not small, but it was not catastrophic. I said, what happened? She said, car repairs were more expensive than I expected. Then the washing machine died, and I had to replace it. My job sent me to a conference, and the reimbursement is not coming until next month. I did the math. She had made a string of decisions and now wanted someone to cover the gap. I said, so what is your plan? She said, I was hoping you could help me. Just this once. I will pay you back as soon as I get my reimbursement. There was the real reason she had wanted the closeness. The ultimate safety net. I said, you want me to loan you $100? She said, I know it's a lot to ask, but I'm really stuck. If I miss this payment, they will start foreclosure. I studied her face for a sign that she understood the irony. I said, let me make sure I understand. You divorced me, kept the house, and now you want me to help pay for it. She said, it is not like that. This is a temporary setback. I can afford the payments normally. I asked gently, can you? Because if you are $800 short after 2 months, maybe this house is not affordable. Her cheeks flushed. She said, I can afford it. I just had unexpected expenses. I said, those will keep happening. The water heater will fail. The roof will leak. Taxes will go up. That is home ownership. She said, so you will not help me? I said, friends do not typically pay each other's mortgages. That is a spouse thing. She said, this is an emergency. I said, this is poor planning. An emergency is when a tree falls on your roof. This is adult life. She stared at me. She said, I cannot believe how cold you are being. I said, I'm being realistic. You wanted independence. Independence means taking care of yourself. She said, crying now, please. I am begging. I will do anything. I said, you could sell the house. She said, sell the house? I'm not selling our house. I said, it is not our house. It is your house. If you cannot afford it, you need to make different choices. She said, what happened to you? You used to care. I said, I still care. That is why I am not enabling bad decisions. She said, it is one payment. I said, it is one payment this time. What about next time? How many do I cover before you admit you are living beyond your means? She did not answer. I stood and said, here is friendly advice. Call your mortgage company and explain the situation. They might offer a plan. Or call your parents. Or take out a personal loan. Those are things people do. She said, my parents already think the divorce was a mistake. I cannot ask them for money. I said, then maybe they are right. I started for the door. She said, following me, what if I pay you interest, like a real loan? I said, what if you acted like the independent adult you said you wanted to be? She said, "This is not fair." I said, "Fairness is not the point. You want out of the marriage. You got what you wanted." She said nothing. I left. On Monday evening, I received a text that said, "Found another solution. No thanks to you." I replied, "Glad to hear it. That is what friends do. They figure things out." 3 weeks later, I drove past the house and saw a small for rent sign in the yard. She had decided to move in a roommate and rent out the house to cover the mortgage. It was a smart decision. I felt proud of her for solving it herself. Life enjoys curveballs. About 3 months after the mortgage episode, I was at my cousin's birthday party at a neighborhood sports bar. I spotted a familiar face across the room, alone at the bar, nursing a beer and wearing the expression of someone who would rather be anywhere else. It was Diana. She had been Jasmine's closest friend during the marriage, though I had rarely spoken to her without Jasmine directing the conversation. I considered whether to approach her. The quiet that had settled between Jasmine and me lately felt valuable. But Diana looked genuinely miserable, and my cousin had always taught me to be polite to someone who seemed to need a friendly face. I walked over and said, "Mind if I sit?" I gestured to the empty stool. Diana looked up, surprised, and said, "Oh, hey. Sure." I smiled and said, "You look like you are having about as much fun as I am." I ordered a beer. She laughed, and I realized I had never really heard her laugh before. It was genuine. She said, "That obvious?" I said, "Let me guess. Blind date gone wrong." She laughed again and said, "Worse. Forced networking event. My boss decided this was a good place to meet potential clients." She gestured around at the televisions, and the people focused on the game. She said, "Turns out nobody here wants to discuss design strategy over wings." I said, "Design?" She said, "Graphic design. Mostly corporate websites and marketing materials. It is not glamorous, but it pays the bills." We slipped into an easy conversation. She was funny, thoughtful, and had opinions about everything from the bad calls in the game to the best place in Cleveland to get tacos. I found myself enjoying the conversation, which surprised me because I had always assumed she shared Jasmine's outlook. After about an hour, she tilted her head and said, "Can I ask you something?" I said, "Sure." She said, "How are you really doing with everything?" I shrugged and said, "Better than I expected. The divorce was the right call." She nodded and said, "I figured you would say that." I asked, "What do you mean?" She said, "Nothing bad. It is just that she complained about you. A lot. But the things she complained about were actually the good things." I said, "Like what?" Diana said, "Like that you were practical and focused on budgets and savings, that you were cautious about big purchases, that you planned ahead." She called that boring. I thought it sounded responsible. I said, "Those sound like complaints to me." She said, "They do, until you watch someone struggle to pay a bill because they spent their money on something unnecessary." I raised an eyebrow. She took a sip of her drink and said, "For example, last month she posted photographs from an unplanned weekend trip. Then she called me in tears about her car payment. I told her to call the bank and work out a plan. I am not in the business of enabling bad decisions." I stared at her and said, "That is exactly what I told her about the mortgage." She smiled and said, "Great minds." We talked until the bar began to close. I walked her to her car. She paused and said, "I always wonder what you were really like. I heard so much, but I never felt like I was getting a full picture." I said, "What picture did you get?" She said, "Honestly, you were painted as boring and controlling. You are neither." She hesitated. She said, "Would you like to get coffee sometime? No drama, no gossip, just coffee." I thought for 2 seconds and said, "I would like that." We exchanged numbers. 2 days later, we met at a coffee shop downtown. It was supposed to be 20 minutes. It turned into 3 hours. We talked about work, books, favorite hiking trails in the Cuyahoga Valley, and art galleries she loved. After we finished our coffee, we walked the streets downtown. When the air turned cool, she said, "So what is your story? How did you get into your line of work?" I told her about the first time I fixed a broken radio at age 10 and how solving practical problems made me feel calm. Then I asked, "How did you end up in design?" She said, "Pure accident. I was pre-med in college. Chemistry had other plans. My roommate dared me to take a design class. I realized I was better at making things look good than memorizing the periodic table. I miss the idea of medicine sometimes, but I like creating something useful, starting with a blank screen and ending with something that helps a business communicate." We kept talking. Dinner followed coffee, then a walk by the lake, then leaning on a railing, watching the city lights flicker. Over the next weeks, coffee dates became dinner dates, and then became weekend plans. She introduced me to art exhibits and farmers markets. I showed her hiking trails and taught her how to play pool at a little place near University Circle. The difference between her and Jasmine was immediate and consistent. Diana paid for her own meals sometimes, never with a flourish, just fairness. She showed up when she said she would. She did not create drama out of minor inconveniences. Most importantly, she treated me like an equal partner in our time together, not as an assistant for her problems. One evening as we walked in a park near her apartment in Shaker Heights, she said, "I owe you an apology." I asked for what? She said, "For not seeing what was truly happening in your marriage." I knew she could be demanding, but I did not realize how heavy it had become. I said, "That was not your job." She said, "No, but I was supposed to be your friend." Real friends tell each other when they're being unreasonable. I stopped walking. I said, "Why did you not?" She said, "Cowardice." It was easier to listen and nod than to tell truths. Watching how she handled the divorce taught me I should have spoken up. I said, "You have now." She smiled. She said, "For what it is worth, you handled it exactly right. You gave her what she asked for." That night, as I drove home, I realized something new had taken root. The weight I had carried slipped away a little more. My ex-wife did not know we were seeing each other. That changed on a Saturday afternoon in the most ordinary setting. Diana and I were at Target debating the merits of different coffee makers. From the next aisle, we heard a sharp inhale. Jasmine's voice cut across the shelves. She said, "What is this?" We turned. Jasmine stood at the end of the aisle, a basket of cleaning supplies in her arm, eyes wide as if she had discovered a crime scene. I said calmly, "Hello. How are you?" She said, mimicking, "How am I?" "You were here with her." Diana squeezed my hand but stayed quiet. We had both anticipated this moment. I said, "We are shopping for a coffee maker. What brings you here?" Jasmine said, "Do not act like this is normal." Her eyes flicked between us, noting how comfortable we were. She said, "How long has this been going on?" Diana said, without raising her voice, "About 2 months. And I have not been your best friend for a while now." That stopped Jasmine. She said, "What does that mean?" Diana said, "It means friendship goes both ways. You called when you needed something. You did not ask about my life. You wanted listeners, not friends." Jasmine said, "I was going through a divorce." Diana said, "That was 6 months ago. Even before that, it was one-sided." I listened, quietly impressed by Diana's steadiness. Jasmine said, louder, "I cannot believe you are dating my ex-husband. That is basic code. You do not date your friend's ex." Diana said, "Former friend. And that kind of code does not apply when the friendship was an arrangement where everyone else was supposed to carry your weight." Jasmine said, "That is not what I did." Diana asked, "When is the last time you asked me about my job or my family or anything that was not your crisis?" Jasmine started to answer and stopped. Diana continued, "When is the last time you called Corey for something other than emergency repairs or money? Your idea of friendship looks a lot like your idea of marriage. Other people exist to make your life easier." Jasmine said, "That is not fair." Diana said, "Neither is expecting people to fix your problems while you offer nothing in return." I stepped in before it escalated further. I said, "This does not have to be dramatic. We are adults." Jasmine turned on me. She said, "Adults do not date their ex-wife's best friend behind their back." I said, "We were not sneaking around. We did not see a reason to announce it. You and I are divorced. You said you want to be friends. Friends respect each other's dating choices." Jasmine said, "This is different." I said, "How?" She said, "She knows things about our marriage. Personal things." Diana laughed once, not unkindly. She said, "Like what?" "That you expected him to handle every household problem while you complained that he was too practical. That you spent money you did not have and grew angry when he pointed out the numbers did not add up." He did not tell me those things. "I listened to you for 2 years." Jasmine looked stunned. She said, "I need to talk to you." "Alone?" Diana said, "We can talk here. You confronted us here." Jasmine looked around and noticed the shoppers pausing at the end of the aisle. She said, "Fine, but this is not over." Diana said, "It is for me. I am done with the drama. Jasmine stormed out, leaving the basket of cleaning supplies sitting precariously on the bottom shelf. Diana picked up the coffee maker box, looked at me, and said, "That could have been worse." I said, "Yes. I expected broken glass." She said, laughing, "Give it time." We finished our shopping and left. 2 weeks later, Jasmine showed up at my apartment door in Lakewood on a Thursday evening, dressed carefully, hair done, makeup perfect, wearing a dress I recognized. She said, pushing past me into the living room, "We need to talk." I closed the door and leaned against it. I said, "About what?" She said, "About us. About this mistake we both made." I said, "What mistake?" She said, "The divorce. This friendship experiment. It is not working. We should fix this." I said, "It is working fine for me." She turned toward me with a serious expression and said, "I have been thinking about what went wrong. I made mistakes. I was probably too demanding sometimes." She swallowed and tried again. She said, "Often. But people can change. I can change." I said, "Why would you want to change now?" She said, "Because I miss you. I miss us. I miss having someone who cares about me." I said, "You mean you miss having someone who solves your problems for free?" She said, "That is not what this is." I said, "Then what is it?" She stepped closer. She said, "It is realizing that what we had was special, and I threw away something good because I thought I wanted independence. Independence is just loneliness with extra bills." At that moment, Diana stepped into the doorway from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel. She said, "Dinner is almost." She stopped when she saw Jasmine, then said, calm as ever, "Good evening." Jasmine said, "This is none of your business." Diana said, "You made it my business when you arrived here, uninvited." Jasmine's eyes widened. She said, "This is not your home." Diana said, "It is now." Jasmine looked between us and said, "You moved in together?" I said, "Last week." It turns out it is easy to live with someone who does not treat you like hired help. Jasmine's face tightened. She said, "We could try again. We could go to counseling." I said, "What problem do I need to fix? My life is better now. I sleep better. I'm less stressed. I enjoy coming home. I have more money because I am not constantly paying for consequences I did not cause." Jasmine said, "I would pay you back for all of that." I said, "With what?" "You just rented out your house and moved in a roommate to keep it afloat." She looked down. I said, "You got exactly what you asked for. You wanted a divorce. We got divorced. You want to be friends. I have been your friend. I have given advice. I have respected your independence. I have treated you like any other friend." Jasmine said, "But friends help each other." I said, "They do, within reason. They do not pay each other's mortgages or drop everything for non-emergencies." Diana took a step forward and said, "Real friends definitely do not show up trying to break up a relationship because they decided they no longer like their own choices." Jasmine said, "I am not trying to break anything. I'm trying to fix what we broke." I said, "There is nothing to fix. We are not broken. We are divorced. By choice. Your choice." Jasmine said, "People make mistakes." I said, "Yes. Your mistake was believing you could keep the benefits of being married without the commitment. You wanted independence until you realized independence requires responsibility." She started to cry, but I did not feel the old instinct to soothe her. She said, "So that is it. You were going to throw away 12 years. I said, "I did not throw anything away." She said, "You will regret this." I said, "The only thing I regret is not insisting on boundaries earlier." She glared at Diana and said, "I hope you are happy. You destroyed a marriage." Diana said, "I did not destroy anything. You destroyed your marriage by treating your husband like an employee." Jasmine pivoted back to me. She said, "Is this really what you want? A rebound with my leftovers?" I felt something inside me go cold. I said, "First, she is not your leftovers. She is not your anything. You threw away her friendship the same way you threw away our marriage. Second, this is not a rebound. This is called a healthy relationship. You would not recognize it. Please leave." Diana said softly, "Now." Jasmine looked around the living room as if seeing it for the first time. She said, "You will regret this." I said, "I will not." After the door clicked shut, we stood quietly. Diana said, "Do you think she will try again?" I said, "Probably. It will not matter." She asked, "Why not?" I pulled her close and said, Because I learned the difference between being needed and being wanted. I choose wanted. Months passed. Through mutual friends, I heard that Jasmine moved back in with her parents in Euclid. The house had finally gone into foreclosure. The roommate arrangement had turned ugly over money and noise and cleaning duties. I felt bad for her, the way you feel bad for anyone facing hard times, but I did not feel responsible for fixing it. That is what healthy friendship looks like. Caring without taking control, supporting without enabling. One evening in late autumn, Diana and I walked along the lakefront, and the conversation drifted to everything and nothing. She said, "I received an offer to redesign a nonprofit's website." I said, "That is great news." She said, "They focus on financial literacy workshops for young adults." I smiled and said, "That is perfect." She said, "I thought you would like that." We talked about creating materials that explained budgets and emergency funds in plain language. She asked, "Would you look over the draft materials?" Not to fix them, just to give feedback. I said, "Of course." Later, over dinner, she said, "I keep thinking about how simple boundaries can feel radical when no one has enforced them." I said, "The hardest part is the first no." She said, "After that, each yes feels more honest." I said, "Exactly." She reached across the table, laced her fingers through mine, and said, "Thank you for teaching me more about partnership than I have learned in years." I said, "You taught me too. You taught me that kindness without honesty is not kindness. It is avoidance." The next weekend, Erin and I helped my parents with some repairs at their house on the east side. My mother asked, as she handed me a box of nails, "How is everything?" I said, "Calm. Good." Erin said, grinning, "He is underselling it." My father nodded and said, "Calm and good are excellent." My mother looked at me for a long moment and said, "You did the right thing." I said, "It does not feel like winning. It feels like finally breathing." She said, "That is winning." A few days later, I ran into Mrs. Johnson, the neighbor Jasmine had once refused to wake. She was leaving the grocery store with a bag of fresh greens. She said, "I heard you moved." I said, "Yes. Lakewood." Mrs. Johnson said, "I am glad. You look lighter." I said, "Thank you." She said, "She came to me once about the smoke detector after all. I told her where to find the battery compartment. She managed." She smiled kindly and said, "People can do more than they think when they try." I said, "You are right." On a snowy evening that winter, Diana and I visited a small gallery opening. She introduced me to a painter who talked about learning to tell the truth in color and negative space. The notion resonated. Sometimes what you do not fill in is essential. On the drive home, Diana said, "Sometimes I want to apologize to you again." I said, "You do not need to." She said, "I was there and I did not stop it." I said, "We all overlook what is inconvenient." Then one day we stopped. In spring, the nonprofit launched their site. The homepage read, "Practical tools, real choices." Diana had used photographs of diverse young adults, and the content explained budgeting with clarity. We attended a workshop one evening. A young man raised his hand and asked, "What if your friends expect you to help them with everything?" The facilitator said, "You will need boundaries. You can care and still say no." I caught Diana's eyes across the room. She smiled. Occasionally, I would receive a stray text from Jasmine, a complaint about a relative, a photo of a dog she was pet-sitting, an article link with no context. I responded politely once, then let silence do the rest. There was nothing unkind about it. It was an honest reflection of distance. One afternoon in June, Diana and I were at a farmer's market deciding between two kinds of honey. She said, "I have a question I have wanted to ask." I said, "Ask." She said, "What did you fear the most the night she said she wanted a divorce?" I thought for a long moment and said, "I fear that I had wasted time, that I had been foolish, that no matter what I did, I would always be blamed. I thought I would never trust someone to build a real partnership again." She said, "And now?" I said, "Now I am grateful. I learned to separate crisis from preference, demand from need, and noise from signal." She leaned her head against my shoulder. She said, "I am grateful too." We bought the honey. On our way out, a street musician played an old jazz melody. We stopped to listen. The notes rose and fell with a kind of earned calm. A year after the divorce, I received a letter that the bank had completed the foreclosure. My name was nowhere on it. I put the letter into a drawer to deal with later. That evening, Sitting on the balcony with Diana, I told her about it. She said, "Do you feel anything?" I said, "I feel like a chapter into the day I moved out. The bank just caught up." She said, "That makes sense. Sometimes when I pass the old block, I slow down out of habit. A different family lives there now. There's a bicycle in the front yard and chalk drawings on the sidewalk. Once, I saw a woman kneeling by the stoop, talking to a little boy while he tied his shoe. She looked patient. The boy laughed at something only he could see. I drove on, feeling strangely at peace. On a quiet Sunday evening, Diana and I watched a storm roll in from the west. She said, "Do you ever think about calling her?" I said, "No," she said, "Good." We sat without speaking for a while, listening to the rain begin to drum the balcony railing. I thought about the word friend and how easily it is misused. A friend is not a person who rescues you from your own choices. A friend is someone who believes you can face those choices and, when necessary, stands beside you while you do. Later that night, I thought about the first moment at the kitchen table, the ring glinting under the overhead light, Jasmine rehearsing her speech. Back then, the word divorce sounded like a cliff. Now it sounded like a road. Different, yes, but walkable. I texted Aaron and said, "Thank you for dinner that night at the bar." He replied, "Always." Then he added, "You sound good." I wrote back, "I am good." Months later, Diana and I planned a trip to New Orleans. We booked a small bed and breakfast near the French Quarter, picked out a list of restaurants, museums, and a walking tour. On our first morning there, over beignet and coffee, she said, "I like how you plan. I feel safe and free at the same time." I said, "That is how I feel with you." We wandered the streets, soaked in the sound of brass from a corner band, and then stood on a balcony at dusk, watching the city lights flicker through the humid evening. On the flight home, I scrolled through photographs of the trip, the two of us by a mural, the plate of red beans and rice, the old ironwork balcony. There was a photograph Diana had taken of me laughing at something she had said. I did not remember the joke. I remembered the feeling, lightness, like weather after a heavy storm. Back in Cleveland, life resumed its ordinary rhythms, which felt extraordinary precisely because they were not dramatic. Work, dinners, gallery nights, hikes. One Saturday, while we checked out a new bookstore, we ran into a couple who had known both me and Jasmine. They asked, "How have you been?" I said, "Well." They asked, "Have you seen her?" Diana said, calmly, "We wish her the best." They nodded. The conversation moved on. There was nothing else to say. The following week, Diana handed me a small wrap box. She said, "Open it." Inside was a simple key on a brass ring. She said, "It is for the apartment, just in case." I trust you. I felt that sentence resonate through 12 years of lessons. I said, "I trust you too." She said, "Then we are doing this right." That evening we made dinner together. Not the theatrical version, where one person pretends to help. Real help. She chopped vegetables. I seared chicken. She stirred a sauce and asked, "Do you remember the night she called about the smoke detector?" I said, "I do." Diana said, "What would you tell that version of yourself if you could go back?" I said, "I would tell him that saying no will feel cruel the first time. I would tell him it is not cruel. It is clarity. And I would tell him there will come a day when he understands the difference between being needed and being wanted." We sat at the table and ate, and then we did the dishes together, which felt quietly, gloriously ordinary. I looked across at her and said, "Thank you for finding me at the bar that night." She said, "Thank you for sitting down." We smiled. Outside, a street light clicked on as the sky deepened. Inside, everything felt steady. In the end, what I know is simple. Love is not a series of emergencies to be solved. Friendship is not a contract for unlimited favors. Marriage cannot be sustained by one person's willingness to carry both loads. That is what the past taught me. The present taught me something even better. When you treat people like capable adults, they often rise to meet that respect. And when someone meets you with equal steadiness, the entire shape of your life changes. I do not romanticize the hard parts. There were nights when I missed the familiar sound of old routines. There were days when I felt a pang of sadness for the version of Jasmine who might have learned these lessons earlier. But the sadness never tempted me to abandon the boundaries that made this new life possible. Caring without controlling, supporting without enabling, saying yes when it is honest, and no when it is necessary. That is where things stand. The past is a story I could tell plainly now, without anger and without apology. The present is a life I chose. If there is a lesson I carry forward, it is this: partnership, whether marriage or friendship, is not a one-way street. It is a road you walk together, each person carrying their share. When that finally happens, everything else becomes much simpler, and the ordinary moments, coffee in the kitchen, a walk in the park, a seat at a quiet bar, feel like the best kind of miracle. If you enjoyed this story, please like, comment, and share this video with your friends. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a powerful story drop.